Well, it finally happened. I finally came across an Anne Rice book that made me just want to completely tear my hair out and give up on her series. That's right, I'm finally on the 10th book in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series, Blood Canticle, which is known for not being one of the best books in the series. This story is the conclusion of Anne Rice's crossover series in the Vampire Chronicles, where she brings together the characters from the Chronicles with the characters from her Mayfair Witches trilogy. Here we get Lestat back as the narrator as well, so you would think it's going to be a great story, but it really isn't. And the plot itself is quite hard to summarise because we just have various plot threads from various books just kind of coming together and having often not very dramatic or interesting resolutions. We get the return of Patsy, Quinn's mother from the previous book, who was murdered by Quinn. Her ghost returns in this book for a bit. We also get the return of the Taltos, and Mona Mayfair, unfortunately, is back in this book, and she goes on a little quest to find her daughter who was a Taltos. And we also have one of the things that Anne Rice is infamous for, which is a contrived romance between Lestat and Rowan Mayfair that just comes out of nowhere, and of course, because it's Anne Rice, it's a very dramatic love affair and is very over the top. If that doesn't sound like a clear summary of the plot, that's because the plot isn't very clear. It's just a big hot mess of just lots of ideas going on, and so it doesn't really have a cohesive narrative. So already you can tell this is going to be quite a negative review, and usually I don't like to do negative reviews, or at least not too negative, but unfortunately I do also want to just review all of the Vampire Chronicles books, so I'm just going to have to bite the bullet and go here. But I will begin by talking about some positives that I found with this book, so let's get to those first. Part 1, F you fanbase. So perhaps the most infamous part of this entire book is the opening passage of the story where we get Lestat back in the driver's seat for the first time since Memnoch the Devil, and he just goes on this huge rant about his audience. And this is clearly not really Lestat speaking here. This is Anne Rice through Lestat speaking to her audience. And while he's always been somewhat of a alter ego for Rice to explore her ideas about religion, and maybe even just a male alter ego, you know, kind of imagining who she could have been kind of thing. You know, it's really clear here that it's not a character speaking, it is just Anne Rice who's very salty about the reviews that Memnoch the Devil got from some people. So just to give a bit of history of that, Memnoch the Devil was, I think, actually quite a good book, but it marked a period in Anne Rice's career when she was going away from her character-based stories and her vampires, and sometimes sort of a pulpy style like we got in Tale of the Body Thief, and she was trying to tell instead a more cerebral story, or more theological story, and some of her fans just didn't like that, and so Memnoch the Devil, I don't think it got bad reviews, I think it got mixed reviews, and some of the criticisms were that people don't want to hear about Rice, hear Rice talking about angels and demons and all this, they want Lestat and the vampires, and this obviously affected Rice a lot, and for many of the Chronicles since, she just focused on different characters. And while the religious themes are all still there, she just kind of put Lestat away. But with this book, he's back properly. Although he was back in Blackwood Farm as well, this is the book where he's finally narrating again. But unfortunately, Rice doesn't seem to be able to take criticism very well, and so we just have this huge rant at the beginning of the book where she berates her readers for not being highbrow enough, for just wanting her to tell some pulpy, trashy novel, and basically she says, well, if you want this trashy piece of crap, I'm going to give you this piece of trashy crap. And so I think that that is just what Rice is doing in Blood Canticle. She just wants to really tease her fans, who she clearly thinks are these imbeciles who don't get what she's trying to do with all this intellectual stuff. And so she gives them a trashy novel. And the reason why I think she's doing this deliberately is because she can write a kind of pulpy, plot-based book. The Tale of the Body Thief is a great example of this. It's not one of these stories that's beholden to all of the kind of grand mythologizing that Rice does, or the theological stuff. It's there to some extent, but it's a mostly character-driven story, and it's not badly written. In fact, I would say it's one of the better books in the series. And Rice has done it with other books that she's written as well, so she can do that kind of thing. So it seems that she's doing something deliberate here. And unfortunately, though, what she's doing is she's kind of just being a bit cruel to her audience and kind of insulting them. Now, this actually could in itself be kind of interesting, if the author wants to kind of play around with their readers' expectations in a way that's inventful, that's artful, that could be really engaging. The problem is, this book doesn't come across like that. This book comes across like someone is having a tantrum, and that's hence the name of the title of this section. It feels like she just wants to annoy people, and it seems like her understanding of what her readers want is something that's poorly constructed, that's an absolute mess of a story. And that isn't the case. They just wanted a bit more Lestat and a little less, Lucifer and God. So that is where I think the book goes awry. Now, I did say that this section was going to be positive, and so just to clarify, the positive point here is that Rice is doing something interesting with this book. And I don't think she does it well. I think there are more artful ways to play with your audience's expectations like that, to respond to criticism in a way that doesn't just come across as someone having a tantrum, in a way that doesn't revolve around you destroying great characters and having terrible plots. It seems like she's kind of throwing the baby out of the bathwater with this book. And so that is why I think ultimately, although it's kind of an interesting book in that kind of sense, in the kind of meta sense that she's trying to have that kind of argument with her fans, at the same time, it's just not done in a very artful way. Part 3. Who are these people? Almost every single character who appears in Blood Canticle, and most of the characters here are not new characters, they're characters from previous books, they are nothing like the characters that we saw in the other books. Obviously, the biggest and most horrific example of this is Lestat himself. Lestat is meant to be a romantic figure. He's meant to be an aristocrat. He's meant to have this incredibly flowery language. But in this book, because he's kind of not wanting to do that, because Rice doesn't want to do that, he speaks in a very erratic style. Sometimes he still speaks in that erratic style. Other times he's saying things like, "Hey dude," like an American surfer bro. Other times he's like saying things that make him sound like some kind of sassy hobo, and it just doesn't work at all. It's incredibly cringy to read, and it makes no sense given who Lestat's character is. And even if you kind of dress it up as a sort of, well, it's Rice playing with the audience's expectations and Lestat poking fun at his readers, sure, but it's still pretty dumb, and it doesn't really make sense, and it's just very inconsistent. Next we have another pretty big offender for me, which is the desecration of Quinn Blackwood's character. Now, I really liked Blackwood Farm. I think it's a fantastic book, and thankfully you can just read it in isolation from this thing, even though they do run on from each other. The main story and the main interest with Blackwood Farm is the story of Goblin and Quinn, and that is actually resolved pretty much within that book. So thank God for that. This book doesn't ruin that book. But Quinn's character in this book is just completely pointless and completely bland. In Blackwood Farm, he's presented as someone who's unsure about his sexuality, someone who's in touch with his feminine and masculine sides, and so he's just interesting. He's an interesting narrator, he's an interesting character to follow around. But in this book, he basically just turns into not even a white knight, because at least a white knight saves someone and does something, but he is basically like that. He's like a wet flannel moaning after Mona Mayfair and doing nothing else for the entire story. An absolute shame, because the previous book was his story, and this book is the continuation of that. And the only real development that we get is with his mother, which is something I will come to later, but it just doesn't go anywhere. And so it just feels like, what's the point of having Quinn in this story at all? And now let's go on to Mona Mayfair, who I've talked about at length before, is a character that I just think is absolutely awful. I've never liked her in any of the books, but the reasons why I've disliked her have changed quite a lot. And in this book, I will actually give her something, because I actually felt pretty bad for Mona Mayfair in this book. When Mona Mayfair gets first introduced in Lasher, she is kind of this nymphomaniac 14-year-old who is a whiz kid and a bit of a Mary Sue, really. And so that's kind of my problem with her there. And then in the previous book, Blackwood Farm, she is basically just this damsel in distress with all of her power gone because she's ill, and it's just kind of pathetic. And in this book, she's pretty much everything and nothing all at once. Like Lestat, she's just completely erratic. One minute she's like kissing Lestat's backside and saying how wonderful he is. The next minute she's giving him some sassy remark and arguing with him. And then the next minute she's hating on Rowan Mayfair and then loving her, and it's just an absolute mess. And I get that she's just become a vampire, so these things are new. But like with Lestat's character, it's just incredibly erratic. And it seems like Rice just basically, if she wants a character to act a certain way, she just makes them act that way because it's useful for the plot right now. And then if they need to act in a different way or talk in a different way for a different scene, for dramatic effect or whatever, she just completely changes their entire character. But the worst thing about Mona Mayfair in this book, and the thing that makes me feel quite bad for the character, is this incredibly awkward scene that she has with Lestat about halfway through, I think. So it's just after she's been made a vampire, and she's wearing this very seductive outfit, And the start takes a look at her and basically says, you need to take off that dress because it's slutty and you can't wear things like that. Like a feminist nightmare about what a patriarchal grandfather is like or something. Completely out of character for the start, but here we are. And Mona argues back, and the start just says some incredibly weirdly out of character sexist things. It really does sound, like I say, like this sort of stereotype of what a sexist man sounds like. And it makes no sense at all. And I'm just not sure what Rice was going for in this scene. Like, is she sexist? Does she hate women? Like, what is she doing here? The only thing that I can think that she might be doing is maybe she's using the start to criticize the character of Mona Mayfair. Because one criticism of Mona Mayfair, especially in the first book when she's seducing all of her family members, some of which are adults, is the sex stuff. And so maybe that's the point. Maybe the start is just sort of invoking those criticisms. But again, it's fine to have a character who invokes something that's going on in the real world. People do that all the time. It can make stories fascinating when you do that. But you have to make sure that the character that you choose is a character that makes sense for them to say those things. It doesn't make sense for the start to say those things. The start isn't sexist. In fact, one of the things that Rice has always said about vampires in previous books and in interviews and everything else is that they're essentially genderless, because vampires have no need for gender, right? Because men and women don't mate in the same way. So all of that gender stuff just goes out of the window with vampires. So it makes no sense that the start would impose those kinds of values onto Mona. And so that to me is a big criticism of the book, because you're telling this big sweeping epic with several novels, with characters built over time. You need to build in a certain amount of consistency. And this book just throws everything out of the window. And even if you took this book on its own merits and just kind of looked at it as a single work, the characters are still incredibly inconsistent within the course of a novel. Like I say, Lestat's different voices, it's just bizarre and ridiculous. And again, it could be done in a way that's kind of entertaining, but it just comes across as incredibly cringy. So it's a big no-no for me when it comes to the characters in this one. Part 4, what is the point of this crossover? So as I've said already, Blood Canticle is the conclusion of a trilogy of crossover novels with the Mayfair Witches series. And so in this section, I just want to actually take a step back and look at this trilogy of books and see how well it kind of hangs together as a piece of work. And unfortunately, it does not hang together well at all. We begin the trilogy with Merrick, which is David Talbot's story. He was recently made into a vampire. He doesn't appear in either of the other two books, but he is the narrator of this one. This story focuses on Merrick Mayfair, who is a new Mayfair character who gets introduced. And at the end of the story, this powerful witch becomes a vampire. And it's like, wow, so where are we going to go with this? Well, actually, nowhere. Because in Blackwood Farm, we focus on a new story, on Quinn Blackwood's story. And, it's a very good story, as I've said. Now, but you would expect something, continuity-wise to come through. And Merrick Mayfair does come in the final part of that novel to do one thing, which is to immolate herself, and that's it. There's no build-up to this. There's no explanation of her motivations for doing so. There's just completely nothing, and so it's just a complete waste of a character. And really, these two books, you really don't need to read them back to back, because the stories are basically irrelevant to each other. They don't really connect in any meaningful way, and it's just a disappointment because, you have this character you've created in the first book, and you just kill them for no reason, with no build-up in the second book. Then we move on to Blood Canticle, and again we have the same problem. And this one's even worse because the books actually carry on from each other, right after the end of Blackwood Farm, we go into Blood Canticle. So you would expect some kind of consistency between these two because they're tied together much more strongly. And yet Quinn Blackwood just goes into the background and we don't care about him anymore. All the focus is on Mona Mayfair, unfortunately, and most of the focus is on Rowan and Lestat and their love affair. And so as a cohesive thing, as a thing that hangs together, it just doesn't hang together at all. Like there's nothing kind of holding these three books together aside from they just happen to be in the same timeline, really. And it's a shame because there were some interesting things that Rice could have done with this trilogy. Like a great example of this again would be Quinn and his mother. At the end of Blackwood Farm, he murders his mother. And so you would expect there to be some kind of fallout of this in the sequel. And there is, you think, his mother's ghost comes back. Like, oh, is she going to reveal what he did? And are people going to find out? And what's that going to do to him and his relationship with his family? No, nothing substantial happens here. If I remember rightly, I'm not even sure if Quinn has a moment really where he talks to his mother's ghost. Maybe he does, but it's not an especially meaningful one if he does. But mainly Lestat resolves this plotline. Like Lestat, who has no real bearing, emotional bearing to Patsy, is the one who deals with this plot. Makes no sense. Likewise, we also get this story with Mona Mayfair and her daughter Morrigan. Now, in the Mayfair Witches series, there's these creature called the Teltos, and Mona gives birth to one of these, but this daughter is taken away from her. And so there's a quest in this book to go and find this daughter. Probably one of the more interesting parts of the book, so I will say that for it. However, again, it's not especially emotionally interesting because we haven't actually seen Morrigan much as a character. And so who cares about this quest? It also just comes out of nowhere. So again, it just doesn't really make any sense for it being there. And of course, we have this romance between Rowan and Lestat, which again isn't built up throughout the course of these 3 books. Rowan appears in Blackwood Farm a little bit, and in this one a bit more, but it's a very contrived romance. Anne Rice does this a lot with her vampire books. The vampires just fall in love with each other for inexplicable reasons, and it just gets kind of absurd after a point, because it's like anything. If you have too much ice cream, you're going to get sick of ice cream. It's not going to hit you in the same way. Likewise, the same is true for romance. If Lestat is going to fall madly in love with everyone that he sees, it means nothing when he falls in love with someone, because that's just what he's like. He could probably look at a toilet seat and he'd fall in love with it. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense. And so this is the issue. There's just no tension in this story. There's just lots of ideas, lots of things going on, but they don't mean anything. So that is the main issue that I have with the story. I just find it incredibly hard to care because Rice doesn't do any of the work that she has done in previous books to really set up characters and their motivations and their interactions with each other. So it just leaves me feeling kind of bored, and it took me a long time to get through this, even though it's one of the shorter books in the Vampire Chronicles series. Part 5, conclusion. Okay, so I apologise to those of you that may be offended by my harsh critiques of this book, but it is also a book that's critiqued by a lot of people, so maybe my harsh critiques aren't really that harsh in comparison to those. I did try to think of some positives with this one. I just found it incredibly hard to do so. I think there is some interest in reading this book if you kind of view it on a sort of meta level, where it's like Rice is clearly angry with the reception of some of her works, and she's just using this book to vent her frustrations at her audience. And that is kind of interesting. There's some interesting insights into Rice's character there, maybe. But, like I said, while it's interesting in that sense, it's not very interesting as a story. The characters are inconsistent, they make no sense. The plot is all over the place. It's just like a hodgepodge of loose ends that she just wraps up in very uninteresting and uninspired ways. And it just doesn't hang together as the conclusion to the trilogy. And it is, in a way, it's very good that she continued the series, because if it ended on this point, that would be pretty bad, because this book is just not a good book. So that was a very negative review, and I am sorry for those of you who may be touchy about the negativity here. But, I, generally speaking, am a big fan of Rice's work. I think she's a great writer. I just think that with this one, she really, threw the baby out with the bathwater. It seemed like she was angry with her fans and just wanted to write a book to annoy them, and she succeeded. So maybe if you kind of view the book on those terms, it is an aesthetic success. Well, not an aesthetic success, but a success on its own terms. But who knows if that's what she was really doing. Another thing that is also true of Anne Rice is that she famously refuses to have people edit her work. And while sometimes that can be a good idea, maybe in the sense that you can sort of, express your true self or whatever, it seems like with this book, she really did need an editor to just read this and say, like, this reads like a draft, because it does read like a draft. It reads like she's sort of in this zone of, right, I'm just going to write this thing, and she's just kind of moving from plot to plot as the ideas come to her, and then she's like, okay, send this off to the publisher, rather than doing this and then thinking, okay, well, what can I take from this? What can I develop? What can I, do to make a more complete story? So I don't know. Those are my thoughts on the book. Mostly negative. I think the characters are inconsistent. I think the plot is all over the place. And I also think it's just a very poor conclusion to these crossover novels. And it is a good thing that Rice carried on with the latter 3 Vampire Chronicles books, because I think it would have been a real shame to end on this very bitter note, because I have heard good things about those later novels, so I'm looking forward to dipping into them soon. That's it for this review though, but do let me know down in the comments, respectfully if you please, what do you think of Blood Canticle? Do you think it's a great book? If you do, let me know why you think that, because clearly I don't, but I'm always interested to get other people's positions. So if you do enjoy this, let me know. If you agree with any of my points, also let me know. But that is it for this video, so take care everyone. Ta-ra!